All right, we're live. Welcome. This is episode 18 of TR Live. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brent. I'm here with Jeff, John, and Mr. William S. Lind.
Good evening.
And a picture of the two smartest Marines.
Hold on a second. I'm just trying to mute the live video so I can pick up the comments from the live chat. Of course, remember, if you want to participate in the show, go ahead and drop us a line on the live chat while we're live, or you can send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. Questions, comments, suggestions for what you want us to talk about, just send it there and we will discuss it. So I think this week is pretty light on the news, but I thought that we should still come on and say hi to everyone, and we can have a kind of a light discussion, but I think this one might be a little bit short. So Bill, where do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to mention again my latest book, which you can get on Amazon, Retroculture. I had an interesting discussion over lunch today with an industrial designer who's visiting from Boston. And what we immediately found ourselves talking about was how America was the world leader in industrial design in its golden age. And that golden age was the 1930s, 1940s, and up into the 1950s. This was the era of men like Raymond Loewy. I think of it, of course, the impact on our railroads, the gorgeous initial diesels, the Alco PA, the EMDE series and F series, the cab units, and the great GG1, the greatest electric locomotive of all time, all styled by Loewy. And he was interested enough, he's going to get the book, because in so many fields like industrial design, we find if we're looking for something good, we now need to look back in time. Looking at what we've got around us now, it's basically a landscape of crap. And if we look to the future, it only looks worse. But we don't have to go back very far to be able to say, hey, we were producing some really beautiful designs. I remember seeing not long ago a 1948 Packard. It was running, but the straight eight engine was so smooth that you couldn't tell it was running by looking at it. You couldn't tell with the engine, with the bonnet open, you couldn't tell the engine was running. It was that smooth. But every surface of the car was curved, which was, of course, enormously expensive to make with all those stampings. But the result was just this incredible flowing line.
Work of art.
It was a work of art, absolutely. And you look at some of the cars, particularly from the very early 30s, again, the big Packards, Pierce Arrows, Cadillacs, they had a look to them that nothing today, everything now looks like a squash toad because it's all dictated not by industrial design, but by aerodynamics. Mm-hmm. And so the designers, the artistic side of everything has been squeezed out by efficiency. And of course, conservatives have never liked efficiency. Jeremy Bentham is not one of our people.
Right.
And anyway, it was interesting that this guy who's doing this for a living immediately saw the potential here of retroculture. So I thought that was, again, a sign that people are beginning to realize we've taken the wrong road. When you've taken the wrong road, what do? You turn around and go back. So hopefully retroculture, the book, will indeed help people to do that. That's what it's intended to do. As far as news goes, as you said, Brent, there isn't a whole lot of it. But I do think that looking at the Democratic debates, the focus has generally been this candidate or that candidate. But what I think people are missing is, what is the collective message that all the Democratic candidates are sending to the American people? And that message is, as Democrats, if you're white, we don't want your vote. If you're male, we don't want your vote. If you're straight, we don't want your vote. If you would like America to be recognizably American, we don't want your vote. If you're a traditional Christian, we don't want your vote. Well, who's left to vote for Democrats at that point? If you look at the if you look at the demographics of people who actually vote, not potential voters, but people who actually vote in all the swing states, over 70% of the voters are white. And here you have virtually all of the candidates saying, well, if you're white, we don't want your vote. Okay.
That's what they lost in the last. That's how they lost the last time.
And what I think this is leading toward is going to be an absolute debacle for the Democrats this time around. I mean, I don't object to that. Never get in the way of an enemy who's making a mistake. But it's just been very, even Biden, who is certainly the most traditional of the candidates, instead of coming out and defending his opposition to busing, busing was an absolute disaster. It destroyed the cities. It drove the white people out of the cities because their kids were facing 1 and 2 hour bus rides twice a day for some absurd racial balance in some school all the way across town.
What practical sense does that make?
It made no sense at all. And it destroyed cities. It destroyed school systems. It was a complete disaster. But even Biden doesn't have the guts to come out and say, yeah, I certainly did oppose busing and I was right.
Mm-hmm.
They're throwing themselves at the feet of the blacks. Well, the blacks are only 13, 14% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And the percentage of blacks who vote is considerably lower than the percentage of whites who vote. So if the Republican Party were writing the script for the Democrats at this point, I'm not sure it would be any different.
No.
I only wish we had a conservative party that were willing to capitalize on that. I think they'll probably very well win in 2020 and some major elections going forward for the next few cycles. But it'll be because of dumb luck, not because they're really fomenting any divisions.
You're speaking of the Republicans here.
Correct.
Yes. No, I agree with you.
Yeah, they'll win because the Democrats chose to lose.
Right, because the Democrats committed political suicide.
Right.
But the Republican Party, again, it's the old line in Washington, it's the evil party versus the stupid party. And the Republicans, they're terrified of political correctness. They're terrified someone will call them a name ending in ist or ism. And they don't see the potential in rallying all the people who the Democrats say they don't want,
mm-hmm.
which is a large majority at this point.
They had questions asked in Spanish. That's how ridiculous of the point that they're at.
Yes, and that's obvious discrimination because now they need to be asked in all, 142 languages recognized by the United Nations, or it's discrimination.
Right.
This is absurd. And you're right, Brent, that the Republicans will only capitalize it by blundering into its benefits. Trump's instincts are such, he will capitalize on them, but he is not the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Now, Brent, you were going to bring up also, and it ties into this to some extent, the parade in Washington, the July 4th celebration, the enormous hoo-ha about stationing 2 tanks and 2 Bradleys near the Lincoln Memorial and doing a fairly modest flyover of some military aircraft.
Yeah, I think people got the impression that there was going to be a North Korea-style military parade, which I would be in favor of. I think that would be pretty awesome. But
yeah. Do something cool for stuff.
I didn't actually expect that would happen, but I think that's what
get the North Koreans to put it on. I mean, they know how to do that really well.
Yeah.
Trump has already invited Kim to the White House, have him bring a few divisions.
Yeah.
And put on a really great parade in Washington. I think everybody'd like to see it.
And if you don't clap hard enough, you get mortared.
Yes, exactly. So the uproar over this was the very definition of a tempest in a teapot. But Jeff, you had mentioned the other point that, okay, we love this military symbolism, but when was the last time our military won? What are we exactly are we celebrating here?
Right. I mean, like after World War II, you had tanks and parade. Even after Desert Storm, there's the troops marching in their chocolate chip desert camis through New York City, and everyone's out to greet them and say, you won, welcome home. It's just like, well, what happened to that tradition of like welcoming home the troops and having a parade to celebrate something? I mean, to me, it's like, so, you know, against traditional military culture to have, you know, everyone gets a trophy type events. That's kind of what the military is doing right here. It's like, well, you know, we have a military, so I guess we better celebrate it. Well, what are we celebrating? Like, it's just it's madness.
George W. Bush did say mission accomplished, I suppose.
True.
Yeah. Just as the real war began.
Whatever he's intending to say that.
Yes. At least the Kaiser didn't say at the Marne, mission accomplished.
Right.
So
yeah, that was my initial reaction to it. I'm just like, I mean, I'm a fan of Trump for a lot of ways, but at the same time, you know, this is kind of what I worried about with him was that, you know, it's bigger, better, badder, and that's the way Trump is. And he kind of applied that to the military too. Like, you know, half of his tweets are we're rebuilding the military bigger and better and stronger than before. But it's like, okay, you're just throwing money at a broken problem. So I guess it's kind of to be expected.
You also have the fact that traditionally Americans, and particularly conservatives, have not worshipped the military. We have not been a militarized country. The founding fathers looked on a standing military with great suspicion.
Right.
The American people, for the most part, have at least been uncomfortable at the idea because, of course, we see so many examples throughout history of those large standing militaries becoming, in effect, political forces of their own, which has happened here, not through coups, but through the enormous financial power of $1 trillion a year to dispense. And so you have the military-industrial congressional complex, which is probably the single most powerful political force in Washington. So this adulation of the military is something, I hate to say so, but it's something rather un-American. That is not our tradition, and it has certainly not been the tradition of American conservatives. We have generally supported a strong Navy because of our geography, but that was to keep foreign conflicts far from our shores. We have generally looked very doubtfully upon the notion of a large army.
Right.
After World War II, what did we do? We demobilized tremendously.
Right. Yep.
The army between the wars was very small, one of the smallest of the major powers. We had a powerful Navy. But now all of the services just grow and grow and grow and grow. And at the same time, they're not winning because war has changed. The kind of wars that they are equipped and prepared for, wars with other states, are exiting stage right as fourth generation war enters stage left. And like most state militaries, whenever we've taken on fourth generation opponents, we've lost.
Right.
It almost is a bit like, again, my favorite analogy to our situation, 17th century Spain. The Spanish had the best army in the world for a century. It didn't lose a battle for a century. Their seamanship with the Armada overawed the English. You know, the English were just jaw-dropping at the Spanish seamanship. But by the 17th century, it's defeat after defeat after defeat, but nobody can mention it. You have to continue to pretend that this is the greatest military. You have to continue to pour the money into it and so forth until finally you have the Battle of Rocroi against the French, and that's basically the end of the Spanish army. And the Battle of the Downs with the Spanish Navy. So it really smells a bit of that to me. As our success rate goes down, the budget and the adulation of the military go up. That's not a healthy combination.
Do you think it's a case of the fact that, you know, traditionally, you know, these people worship the ashes of something that's just not there anymore, as opposed to actually preserving the, I guess, the fire, quote unquote, that was actually there to keep it going?
Yes, and it's also a military's desire to stick with the passing generation of war because it's what it knows.
Right.
To the knights on horseback, musketeers were terrorists.
Right. Yeah.
And indeed, they regarded them as such, and had orders to blind any musketeer who was caught
Cheating.
and so forth. Cheating. Yeah, exactly. So you always see this almost desperate desire of a military to adhere to a generation that's in fact gone. And of course, we're not one generation behind at this point, we're two. We are still a second generation military. War is moving to the fourth generation. This is a prescription for, again, Spanish irrelevance.
Interesting.
And we got an interesting question, Jeff, you weren't on last week, about training for maneuver warfare, free play training. We discussed that at some length. But of course, you got out of the Marine Corps as a captain about a year ago. I did a column for TR not long ago, looking at what seems to be at least the promise of a new effort in the Marine Corps with the incoming Commandant, General Bergman, to make maneuver warfare real. I mean, maneuver warfare is Marine Corps doctrine on paper, but as you know, it's not what the Marine Corps does. It still does the old second generations French stuff. And the question that I think is perhaps worth some discussion is, okay, if you're the new Commandant and you want to make maneuver warfare something the Marine Corps or any other service does, as opposed to just writes about and talks about, uses the vocabulary as buzzwords, what do you have to do? And what you have to do is you have to align the practices of the institution, and particularly it's what it rewards and what it punishes, with the qualities that a maneuver warfare military requires. For example, we all know maneuver warfare requires commanders with imagination and boldness who will take risks, and like in investment, like in life itself, the rule is high reward, high risk, low reward. Well, maneuver warfare is a high risk, high reward approach to war. You need commanders who've got a lot of brains, a lot of imagination and creativity, and a lot of willingness to take responsibility, make decisions, and live with the consequences. But what is the military, Marine Corps, any other service? What do we promote? Do we promote those kinds of people? Are those the guys who get the great fitness reports? We all know the answer is no. What we promote is the guy who's very careful and cautious, avoids responsibility, never makes any mistakes because he never makes any decisions or takes any initiative. And you can't, on the one hand, call for boldness and daring, and on the other hand, institutionally penalize it and reward the opposite. You're going to get the behavior you reward, not the behavior you call for. And I think this runs throughout the organization. The best book on this, by the way, is Martin Van Krefeld's Fighting Power, which contrasts the US Army in World War II and the Wehrmacht as institutions. And it looks at all of these institutional factors, promotion system, training system, how they built unit cohesion, all of these kinds, or didn't in the case of the US. And what you see is two radically different institutions, each consistent with its way of war. Second generation with the Americans, third generation maneuver warfare with the Germans. Don Vandergriff has done the best work in terms of the changes we need to make now. He's currently working at Quantico, but the Marine Corps isn't making much use of him, at least at present, to develop for the Marine Corps his ideas. He's written several books on this and really great stuff. But we know we have to do things like end up or out. This is the promotion system where if you don't constantly get promoted, you have to leave. Well, this immediately undermines strength of character because, again, you're desperately trying not to blot your copybook because one blot on it and you have to get out. You're done. And the guy who has no blots because he's done nothing. But he gets promoted and you have to get out. We know we have to greatly reduce the size of the senior officer corps because there's nothing that creates centralization and bureaucracy more than an officer surplus, an enormous officer surplus above the company grades. We know we have to separate pay and grade so that if you elect to stay in, say, as a captain your whole career, as you can in most militaries, your pay goes up with time to reflect the fact you have a family and the kids are growing and all the expenses grow. We know we have to create cohesive units. I just got a letter from a friend of mine, former student, who's a Swedish, Royal Swedish Marine officer. He just gave up his position as operations officer of an amphibious brigade, which he had had for 8 years.
Wow.
In the Marine Corps, Jeff, what is that, about an 18-month assignment?
Yeah, that's standard is 18 months on. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So you just get there, you begin to figure out what needs to be done, and it's time to move. And
Right.
this runs through the whole organization. It's tremendously costly. It costs the taxpayers billions and billions of dollars in these moves every year.
Looks like jack of all trades but master of none.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's driven a lot of it by the officer surplus, because if you have one of the few real jobs, you've got a whole line of guys standing behind you waiting for their lick, the ice cream cone.
Right.
Now,
Do you think that part of the idea behind the personnel system is to keep people moving, so there's no risk of revolts or anything like that?
No, what drove it were problems that occurred as we mobilized for World War II, where we had a shortage of officers. Remember, we had a very small military very small army, particularly between the wars, and we resorted to the 90-day wonder. The German motto was better no officer than a bad officer. Our motto was better a bad officer than no officer. So you had guys as officers who had had a few months of training and hadn't a clue what they were doing and got their men killed in droves.
There's a lot of accounts of the Americans getting, they'd be over there for a year, and then they get this West Point guy, and all of them hate him because they're like, this guy has no idea what it takes.
And he gets them all killed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly. Right. So that was part of it. Part of it was we wanted to have, therefore, this big officer corps so we could fill it out quickly with enlisted men for another World War II type conflict. But we're not going to fight another World War II type conflict. So it's at this point becomes a huge burden to us. Now, it was military considerations, but again, it's backward looking. It's saying, okay, these were the problems in World War II, so let's fix them for the next World War II.
Yeah.
And I mean, among other things, we can't build equipment in any quantity anymore. You can't create a World War II army. You can't do the mass mobilization. You couldn't equip them. We know that we have to stabilize assignments so that, as in most European armies, an officer will have his position. 8 years is a lot, but 3 to 5 years as a battalion commander or ops officer, something like that. That's fairly normal. 18 months, again, you just begin to figure out what needs to be done and you're going. If you get a commander, and I've seen this in battalion after battalion, who gets maneuver warfare, he's just getting things moving the right direction. His 18 months are up. A new guy comes in who doesn't get it, and it all goes back to where it was, which is why our military is on the eternal sine wave when it comes from moving to the second to the third generation. We know we need to create cohesive units among the troops. This has been literally a killer of American troops, and still is, from World War II onward. An individual replacement system and a system that moves people around constantly as individuals, so that you can't train to a high standard because you're always getting a dribble of new untrained people coming in. In combat, nobody looks out for the new guy because nobody knows him, which means he's usually dead in 48 hours. A maneuver warfare military puts tremendous emphasis on unit cohesion.
Relationships.
Right, right. And so you have to keep the people together for a considerable period of time. What it really means is you, for Marine Corps, you get sent to boot camp. Your group in boot camp all goes into a unit together. They get what's now at the School of Infantry and so forth. They get that in the unit from the officers and NCOs they're going to be working for. And then that unit is stabilized for at least 24 months, and that's probably short. The Germans did things like they would march a unit, road march it, for 1,000 kilometers from Germany to Russia. Well, by the end of that road march, you've got a pretty cohesive unit.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, it's also true that you are not going to have unit cohesion if you have women in the unit, because the men, instead of forming a band of brothers, will see each other as rivals for the favors of the women. So that's a huge destructive factor in creating the kind of cohesion you need to do maneuver warfare. So anyway, the point is that we know historically what needs to be done, if you're going to have a military that can do maneuver warfare, but it means almost everything changes. And if we don't do that, it's just going to remain words on paper.
Bill, I'm reminded by that of your articles for the American Conservative about a plan for $100 billion military. And in there, you talked about how the National Guard should be the primary army, more or less.
Yes, and that's our historic tradition, by the way. But in this case, it takes on a new relevance, because the real threat of fourth generation war is not that we're fighting guerrillas in the Hindu Kush or in Syria or Iraq, where we shouldn't be anyway. The real threat is the fourth generation threat here. And of course, mass immigration by immigrants who don't acculturate is an ideal basis for fourth generation war. And we already see that with the Hispanic gangs. Gangs are a classic fourth generation warfare entity. Well, who are the backup for the police in any situation in this country? It's the National Guard.
Yeah.
So the National Guard, or I remember telling the Norwegians this, the Home Guard, call them what you will, in fourth generation warfare, they become the most important service. And instead of them existing to support the regulars exist to support them. So absolutely. And this again is consistent with our historic tradition, which was a very small regular army and a militia. It's also important, Brent, however, that as we see fourth generation war develop in this country, which again we're already seeing, it's not a good development, but it's happening. It is what we have to prepare for. You want to make sure you only have one militia. As soon as you have multiple militias, you've got Syria or Libya. You have got an absolute disaster. So it becomes very important that we have a militia, but that we have one militia that everybody regards as legitimate. And people do regard the National Guard as legitimate because it's local guys who enlist to help their neighbors in emergencies. They're not enlisting to fight in Iraq and Syria.
Unfortunately, that's where they went.
I know, and it's a complete misuse of them.
Yeah.
There is a rumor around that the Adjutant General of the Texas National Guard has said that she, in this case, will not accept any orders sending Texas Guardsmen overseas at this point because they're all needed on the border.
Oh, yeah, I know.
And that's an important development because, of course, that is what the Guard is for. I think with President Trump, she will probably get backed up on doing that. Now, if it were a Democrat president, she'd probably be brought up on charges in court-martial. But of course, she's absolutely right. The Texas Guard is needed on the Texas border. That's where the threat is.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, going back to the Republicans blundering into success, what do we do as voters? Because we can't realistically keep voting for Republicans and just hoping that one day they'll try to win and one day they'll actually fix something.
Well, the answer is you have to be more than a voter. In other words, you have to get involved in Republican Party politics, intra-party politics, and transform the party from within, from a Wall Street, I've got mine party of guys who just really only care about themselves, to a genuine conservative party, a party that understands that we need to, again, referencing retroculture, take America back. And the theory some people have as well, it'll be better to form a third party, but the system...
That was going to be my next question.
No, because Paul Weyrich, who I worked with for decades and who was one of the great behind-the-scenes political operatives of the right of the 20th century, always said that is a chimera. It can't be done because the two parties have so rigged the system that it is virtually impossible to create a successful third party. Obviously, both parties have a common interest in making sure there's only two parties.
Yeah.
And they've done that. So what the alternate course that is much more practical and much more doable is to take the Republican Party from within. We did this in the past. We did it between Goldwater and Reagan. And then we've kind of lost it over the years in the Bush years and all of that sort of thing. And it needs to be done again. But this time, of course, the conservatism is not the conservatism of Ronald Reagan. Now we're talking a populist conservatism. We're talking about a conservatism that is about fighting cultural Marxism. We're talking about a conservatism that represents the heartland against the coastal elites. And it's absolutely doable, and it will bring electoral success. There's no question about it. But the current Republican Party leadership, for the most part, would rather lose elections than go that route.
Yeah. Part of me wants to see them go the way of the Whigs, just because I think they deserve it.
Well, the Whigs certainly deserved it. As the late rector of my Anglican church said, English history can be summed up in 4 words: Tory good, Whig bad. But the problem again is, even if you're only preserving the outer husk of the Republican Party, because the system is so rigged to be a 2-party system, that's what you have to do.
Yeah, you need the institutional continuity.
Right.
Do you see economic collapse being the only way to really stop that from perpetuating itself?
No, again, I think...
Because how do you get elected if they control the money, all funding to be reached?
They don't control all the money. There is a lot of money that is conservative as opposed to Republican. Now, you have both. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party has a lot of loyalists who the loyalty is to the Republican Party.
Right.
And a lot of them are wealthy and write big checks. But there is also a lot of genuinely conservative money, both big donors and lots of small donors. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it can't be done. Again, this was done between 1964 and 1980. It was done successfully.
Right.
And it can be done again.
But it's not even really the money, it's the media. The media is controlled by those vested interests as well.
But the media is now largely bypassed by the new media. And of course, Trump has shown that very clearly, because he's used the new media very effectively against the old media. Mm-hmm. And he's won, actually.
Right. But he's a billionaire.
Well, maybe.
He's not necessarily as easy to be litigated out of existence as, say, we would be.
It isn't so much an issue of being litigated out of existence. The issue is, again, internal Republican politics, party politics, building up delegates at the local level, turning those into delegates at the state level and the national level. This again, Paul Weyrich was the master of this. It is a process of behind the scenes internal political organization. And there is money to support it.
Don't get me wrong, I'd love to see it. It would be great to see.
But it doesn't happen overnight.
Sure.
There has to be a concerted effort. President Trump opens the door for this because he represents the new direction the party should take if it wants to win. But just opening the door doesn't work if there's nobody to go through it.
Sure.
So I'm not, Paul could and would have created the kind of movement I'm talking about, but he's no longer with us. Mm-hmm. And certainly that's not my expertise.
Right, yeah.
I don't know who has that expertise now. There are people out there certainly who do, but that's what's required if we're going to take the Republican Party back from Wall Street and make it again a party of the heartland, which is what we need.
Did we have another piece of news?
You were going to talk a little bit about this Colin Kaepernick absurdity of Nike urinating all over itself because it dared put an American flag on some shoes.
Yeah, right. Nike dying of colon cancer. Yeah.
The cowardice of these corporations in the face of cultural Marxism is truly astonishing.
Right.
But again, it's a free market, so the answer is very simple. Don't buy their products.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it was Michael Jordan, I think, in the 90s who said that, because he's a staunch Democrat. And people came out and said, how come you're not more politically active? He said, well, Republicans buy shoes too.
But they won't be buying Nikes.
Right,
for a
not
while.
anymore. Yeah,
No,
right.
not-
Maybe they'll be going to Jordans.
It is also, or New Balances, some of which at least are made in the United States. It's astonishing to me that a corporation would cower before an objection to the original American flag,
Right.
the flag under which we fought the revolution.
It's astonishing, really. And this guy's a nobody. He's not even playing.
No, he's a complete has-been.
Yep.
And again, what it shows is the bottomless depth of the moral cowardice of corporations in the face of cultural Marxism.
Absolutely.
That kind of calls into question the capitalism worship of the mainstream GOP. We said work on some messaging to help them get over that.
Well, as Lenin said, that the capitalists will sell the rope used to hang them.
Right.
And there's no question that business is always looking for the course of least resistance. And larger considerations normally go by the wayside.
And Nike's looking at this from, well, it's publicity. It's not good or bad, but this was definitely bad publicity.
This was bad publicity. And I suspect Nike sales are not going to do well much of the United States, where suddenly it's rejected the flag under which we fought for our independence.
Yeah.
Nice way to commemorate the 4th of July.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yes.
With a lot of
And no one can come back to people like this Kaepernick character and say, you're an idiot. This is absurd.
Right.
Yeah, I guess Nike had some kind of cushy deal with the state of Arizona so they could put a factory there, and they lost that because of this, so that's good.
That showed a little guts on the part of Republicans, because normally they say, oh, well, it's bringing business to the state, we can't touch it.
Yep.
They had the guts to say, take your business and shove it. We don't want you here. We're not paying a dime to you if you disrespect our flag.
Speaking of injustices, they use Chinese sweatshops to make their shoes.
Yes,
We want to talk about irony here.
Yes, and it's I'm sure the American flag was made in a Chinese sweatshop.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yes, as I said, New Balance, which also makes the best shoes, makes at least some of theirs here in the United States.
Yeah, I have a pair of New Balances made USA. When I was shopping for some running shoes, I was like, well, I want some running shoes made USA, and researched, and sure enough, New Balance still does make some models, some pairs in the USA.
Yeah, I just got some made that there's made in the USA. Needless to say, I will not be using them for running. I only run if something larger than me is chasing me.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen too often.
Not very.
I'm glad that some of these governors and some Republicans are actually having the courage to fight the culture war now, which I think Trump has emboldened them to do, and maybe they were too scared to, or whatever. With Trump's victory, they saw that some people, hey, the culture war does matter. Maybe the economy isn't the first thing on people's minds every day when they go to vote. It's our culture. And so Trump, I think, emboldened a lot of people that were maybe on the fence about it. Should I just cower to the political correctness, or should I actually fight for what people want me to fight for? And so I think good on the governor of Arizona saying, screw you, we're not going to bring your company here if you disrespect our country this way. So I think that's great.
Again, it surprised me that a Republican governor had the guts to do that, because normally,
Right, I agree.
Normally they just spread their legs for any corporation.
Right.
So do we have any inquiries, any mail or anything?
Well, that's where I was going. If we don't have any more news, I've got a few questions we can dive into. We got a comment on our last episode on 17 from John Best. He says, I have some questions for Mr. Lynn. The loyalists in Northern Ireland, the Rhodesians, and Hezbollah all successfully engaged in 3 to 4 generation warfare to maintain or create their own state based on their nation and overthrowing the pre-existing state. Is this a pattern you think could continue as 4th generation warfare spreads, the globalist imperialist states being overthrown and new national states of a few 100,000 to a couple million people being formed?
Well, I think the answer is yes. In other words, fourth generation warfare is likely to see the breakup of large states. And out of that will come, in some cases, new states. That's probably the best possible outcome because the state arose to bring order. And that's the first requirement of any human society: order, safety of persons and property. That's what the state arose to do, and it did it. Without the state, as our old friend Hobbes reminds us, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So the best possible outcome as these failing states, including, in a way, our own, break up, is that new states come out of it. And of course, I write about this in my novel, Victoria, under the pen name Thomas Hobbes, because it's an update of his book, Leviathan. But that's the best case. What's going to happen in a lot of cases, you're going to get quasi-states, you're going to get tribal regions, you're going to get ungovernable spaces, you're going to get areas of permanent war, much as you had in Western Europe between the fall of the medieval order and the rise of the state. As Barbara Tuchman put it in her book with this title, The Calamitous 14th Century. And so I would not presume that the collapse of large, in effect, multicultural states is going to result automatically in the rise of new states on their territory. That's the best case. And a lot of places, the outcome is not going to be best case.
The next email is from John Cortez. He's got a kind of a long one, so I'll summarize. He's got one question at the beginning that he kind of elaborates on, and then a few at the end. So the first one is, what I found most unrealistic about Victoria was that the protagonist wasn't immediately put on dozens of watch lists and crushed by the FBI for a process crime or some felony he inadvertently committed in his day-to-day existence. How would you address this?
I would address it by saying that he's too small a fry for a very busy FBI to even notice. He turns out in the end to be an important historical figure, but he certainly doesn't start off that way. He starts off as one of an enormous number of people in a United States that's coming apart because the federal government, having been taken over completely by the cultural Marxists, has lost its legitimacy. He is one of many people reacting to this situation and trying to bring out of it some kind of alternative. The FBI doesn't have enough resources in any way, shape, or form to keep an eye on all those people. By the time he starts to emerge as the important leader he becomes, as Victoria made clear, more and more of the police are coming over to our side. We talked a bit about this last week. Most of the police, including most of the people in the FBI, are culturally on our side. And when things start to come apart, for now they've got to protect the paycheck. But when things start to come apart, they're going to be with us. So as Victoria lays out, the police in many cases become our protagonists' most important allies, particularly by passing him information.
How would lone non-government actors best bait opposing non-government actors who are far more organized, network, disciplined, better trained, and capable into mistakes on the moral dimension of 4GW?
I'm not sure I understand the question here.
The way I take that is we see Antifa violence in the streets, and
Right.
how do we bait them and people aligned with them into moral mistakes?
Well, it's very easy. And that is never start the violence ourselves and do everything in our power with video cams and so forth to make it very clear that they started the violence. My information, including from some state police present at Charlottesville, was that the left started the violence. Most recently in Portland, Oregon, It's very clear the left started the violence. We have to make it very clear the right does never start the violence. Obviously, at a certain point, we have to defend ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. But we should never start it, and we should go to great lengths to document the fact that the other side started it and bring that out publicly, because the mainstream media won't cover it. Although even the New York Times at one point did with Charlottesville. Even the New York Times appeared to start on the left, which it did. For the most part, we will have to rely on the alternate media to get the word out. But if we have the pictures, if we have the movies, in effect, the film showing it, that's pretty powerful.
It's just amazing how little even genuine facts have on a conditioned populace. And that's really what we're facing, is people that aren't able to differentiate between fact and fiction. So how do we address that?
Well, that's a fundamental problem that comes with in effect, the video age, because now seeing isn't believing. In other words, you can fake all of these pictures, the film, everything else can all be faked. Yeah. But if we have multiple sources of it in these cases, not just one source, but if we have multiple people there taking it from different angles and so forth, at a certain point, it becomes pretty clear what happened.
You would hope.
So we should always, any force we use should always be purely for defense and nothing else. But we should always rigorously document the other side's behavior. I think you had mentioned a case earlier, Brent, in Portland, Oregon, where someone tried to charge someone on the right who had slugged someone on the left. And the police came out and said, we've got the video cam. It was self-defense. Because the guy on the left had first slugged the guy on the right.
Right.
That's the kind of thing we need to do. And we need to do it over and over and over again. It's doable and it takes time, but eventually the evidence starts to build and people start to begin to realize, hey, yeah, it really isn't the people on the right who are starting this. It's the left.
So the next question, what can an individual do legally that costs him next to nothing, but costs the opposition more than nothing? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, the most important thing that costs next to nothing for us and causes a huge problem for the other side is to expose political correctness for what it is, as cultural Marxism. Again, I have a new book out. I'm bring a copy today. I think I showed it on our last show, simply titled Political Correctness, edited by myself and Richard Hawkins. I think the subtitle is A Deceptive and Dangerous Worldview. And get the book around, read it, tell other people about it, use the video, which was produced by Free Congress Foundation, the video History of Political Correctness. It's about a 20-minute video documentary, and it's very powerful. It isn't just me talking. We interviewed Martin Jay, the principal American scholar on the Frankfurt School, the guys who created cultural Marxism. And he's, of course, on the left. He was chairman of the history department at Berkeley when we interviewed him. And he spills the beans that this is a variant of Marxism and that it's the basis of political correctness. So if we can simply get the average person to understand that this stuff that you're told you have to be afraid of and is your moral superior is in fact a variant of Marxism, it's in trouble, because the average American does know that Marxism isn't good.
And you answered his last question by getting into cultural Marxism. So there we have it. Last question, or last email, is from Joe Lucian. It says, good evening, gentlemen. He actually sent this while we're live. So remember, you can send it anytime. We'll read it, answer questions, comments, or whatever. Joe says, I just finished reading The Real Lincoln by Thomas DiLorenzo, professor at Loyola. This book gave a totally different view of President Lincoln than what I learned in school. Themes included how Northern mercantile type economy bred corruption and inefficiency, tariffs very punitive to the South, massacre of Southern civilians by the Union Army, Emancipation Proclamation was a scam since it applied only to areas in the South where the Union had no control and thus could not implement freeing the slaves. States' rights of succession, probably means secession, much more in this book, but I was interested in your view of this period of history and how some of these issues apply to current events in the country.
Well, virtually everything you're told in school about Lincoln is hagiography. It's not biography. Lincoln's, the notion that Lincoln is this great abolitionist is completely false. His focus was preserving the Union. He was quite willing to continue slavery in the southern states if it preserved the Union. Slavery was, he was not an abolitionist. He used the abolitionist support politically, but his focus was maintaining the Union. There's no question in my mind that secession was legal. And it's interesting, it's been speculated that the reason Jefferson Davis was not tried for treason after the war is because they were afraid the Supreme Court would rule that secession was legal. Obviously, the suspension of habeas corpus that Lincoln did was completely illegal. His actions in Maryland were completely illegal, essentially just running roughshod over the state to force it to stay in the Union. The tariff issue is now virtually never discussed. It was one of the major reasons that brought about the war, because the North wanted high tariffs to protect our industry. We industrialized under tariff protection. President Trump's trying to reindustrialize under tariff protection, which is reasonable policy. But it really hurt the South because the South was agricultural and it could get better products cheaper from England, except for the tariffs. So the South needed low tariffs. The North forced through the high tariffs. And Southern apologists for slavery made the point that if a slave got sick, if a slave was too old to work, they still had food and clothing and shelter. That was not true of the Northern industrial worker. If you were a Northern industrial worker, you got hurt on the job, there's no workman's comp, there's nothing. You don't show up for the job, you don't get paid. It doesn't matter that you lost your leg yesterday on the job because a train ran over it. Not my problem, is the industrialist's view, and suddenly you and your family are on the street with nothing. So the view that we're given of Lincoln and of this whole period of the Civil War itself, of the move up toward the war, this is all what I call a comic book version of history. And the real history is indeed very different. Had Lincoln lived, it's interesting, had he not been assassinated, and this has to be speculation, of course, but first of all, he did not want to punish the South. Remember, his focus was the Union, and that remained his focus. So you would not have had Reconstruction. He would have opposed it. And that would have made him an extremely unpopular president with the post-war Congress, which was dominated by people who wanted revenge on the South. His position in history would be very different today, as would JFK's, because Vietnam was Kennedy's war, if he had not been assassinated. Actually, it would have been better for the South if Lincoln had not been assassinated, because you would not have had Reconstruction.
Is it true that there was an arrangement, or at least a considered arrangement, to possibly move the slaves back to Africa after the war?
And Lincoln favored that.
That's what I thought.
Yes. Yeah. Lincoln said there is no way that the slaves can be integrated, blacks can be integrated into American society, and he was in favor of sending them back to Africa. And of course, there was a movement to do that, which resulted in Liberia.
Yeah, Liberia, Monrovia.
Yes,
a couple, yeah.
Precisely. So this was actually a movement that had been going on for some time. There was widespread thought among Northerners, including Northern abolitionists in many cases, that there's no way we can integrate blacks into what was an Anglo-Saxon society, and they have to be sent back to Africa. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually Lincoln favored that.
Right.
Well, that's all the email I've got, and I think we're out of news. So
I think so too. Well, we'll have a shorter show tonight, but I hope no less controversial than usual. And
Well, we ended on sending slaves back to Africa, so
well, that was
And then on that
that again. Not only was it a widespread plan, it was done to a not insignificant degree.
Mhm.
And up until the 1960s, it was the descendants of former American slaves who ruled Liberia, and on the whole ruled it pretty well. I mean, Liberia's fate since then has been much less happy.
It's funny, they sent them over there and then they just enslaved their own people.
Well, basically, remember the 1830 census showed over 1,700 black slave owners in the United States, and I said, if I remember right, owning
Wow.
about 17,000 other blacks as slaves.
I had no idea. Wow.
Oh, yes.
anywho, on that note,
Hey, those are facts. They may not be mentioned in today's classroom.
right. All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back again next week. Send us your questions and your comments and article suggestions or things you want us to talk about, and we'll discuss it. So have a good night.
See you guys.
Good night.
Thanks. See ya.